So Diablo 4 has been getting some pretty massive overhauls to the majority of its systems, whether it be leveling, gearing, endgame progression like Paragon boards, to nightmare dungeons, to even the open world. Pretty much every piece of Diablo 4 has been touched in some way, and all of these massive overhauls have brought the game closer to Diablo 3 and further away from Diablo 2. And this fight of Diablo 4 being kind of in the middle between Diablo 2 and Diablo 3 has been going on since the game was first revealed and they first started to do their quarterly updates. Now with Diablo 4 going much more towards Diablo 3 now, we've actually seen some really old systems being reintroduced. And you can easily see this when comparing the runes we got with Vessel of Hatred to the old runes we got revealed when Diablo 4 was first revealed. But runes weren't the only interesting system to be scrapped early on in Diablo 4's development. So that's what I mainly want to look at in this video. Some of those old design decisions and see what of those old systems could potentially be brought into Diablo 4 today. Now, if you're somebody that hasn't been following Diablo 4 since it was first revealed and following all of its quarterly updates, you may not know that during those few years of pretty much only getting quarterly updates for the game, anything the developers showed us, whether it was affixes, whether it was talking about how much they want loot to drop, anything they were talking about in regards to Diablo 4, the community would always tell them, no matter what it was, to be more like Diablo 2 and less like Diablo 3. And this actually painted a lot of Diablo 4's development going into launch. If you remember, or if you played at launch of Diablo 4, the game was significantly slower in terms of actual combat. It had significantly less enemies on screen for the majority of the time. You leveled much more slowly. You got generally a lot less gear drops. A lot of the development was painted from all of the feedback that players wanted it like Diablo 2. Now, obviously, going into Season 6 and Vessel of Hatred, pretty much everybody that plays the game now wants a game more like Diablo 3, and that's why they've started to go into that direction. And that will also play pretty heavily into a lot of the systems and development we're going to go over in this video, because I could see some of these systems coming to Diablo 4 because the developers aren't developing this game to make it like Diablo 2 anymore. Now, the easiest place to start is runes, and if you don't know, right when Diablo 4 was announced, we actually got some runes, or early versions of runes, showed off that in the subsequent quarterly updates were pretty much scrapped, and they did say that they would be working on runes for the future of Diablo 4, but they wanted to make sure to get it right. But the rune system we got with the Vessel of Hatred at a base is actually really similar to the first rune system we got shown. And the main through point between these two rune systems is that they are both basically conditioned and effect systems. And that is actually what they were calling the runes back then. You'd have a condition rune and an effect rune. So the example we got was when you freeze an enemy, activate the next socketed rune. That would be the condition, and you could combine that with an effect rune. And this effect rune was, when active, reduce a random skill cooldown by 15%. So you'd freeze somebody, it would reduce one of your cooldowns. You would put both of these into an item like we have now. It would combine them, and that's the effect you would get. At a baseline, you can see how this is pretty similar to the rune system we got now. Just the rune system we have now is a bit more complex and adds multiple elements to it. This old system didn't have the offering system that you could then overflow runes to get even more. This old system seemingly also didn't have any way for the different rune words to interact. So like right now, you could have a rune word that when you say cast a skill with a cooldown, it casts an ability from another class. Then your other set of runes could give you offering when you cast an ability of another class, then that could activate some other skill that could potentially also be an ability from another class. So there's multiple different elements in the rune system we actually got, but you can very much see how they updated this old system to add it into Diablo 4. Now, when going back to these old quarterly updates, the system that I think was changed the most from these initial quarterly updates until the launch of Diablo 4 was actually the gear rarity, because we have a completely different gear rarity system for the most part than they were initially showing off. So in one of the first quarterly updates, we got all of the rarities they were designing to put in the game, and part of it's pretty similar to right now, but then they just go completely off track and have something completely different to what we have right now. So right now, we have normal, we have magic, we have rare, we have a legendary, we have a unique, and then we also have a mythic unique, which used to be uber uniques. They're basically just massively juiced up unique items. But when you go back to one of these old quarterly updates, they had normal, magic, rare, then they had one section that was legendary and set items. They also explained that they wanted set items to be pretty much the exact same power as legendary items. Then after legendary and set items being in the same tier, they then had ancient and then mythic. Now this mythic rarity is also nothing like the mythic rarity we have now, which the mythic rarity we have now is basically just renaming and recoloring uber uniques. But this old mythic rarity was red, and it was actually completely different. They actually said that mythic items were basically the most powerful items in the game, and they were so powerful that you can only equip one at a time. So this rarity system is completely different to the one we have now, because they didn't even have things like uniques. They didn't have uber uniques later to be turned in mythic uniques we have now. They had set items, they had ancient items, and a different mythic rarity, and all of these could potentially come back in some form or another. Now first off, you have set items. This is also a system that they said they were still going to be working on for the future of Diablo 4, and this was actually said by multiple developers not too long before Diablo 4 actually launched. So this isn't something they said like 5 years ago and that's a different plan now. This is something that they said right up until Diablo 4's launch, and I think sets, if done well, can add more variety into the game. I think most people just don't want sets to be what they were in Diablo 3, where 99% of the builds used a set, because once you got your set items, you basically multiplied your overall power by like thousands of times. So I don't think the players nor the developers want that type of set system, but these could come back in another way where maybe they're smaller sets or much less powerful sets, but sometimes they have effects that you would want strong enough to actually add in these set items, and it would probably be a smart design space to keep set items at basically the same power as the legendary items. So you would need to actually get that set of gear, whether it be like a 2 set or a 3 set, to make it as strong as just having legendaries in those slots. But depending on that set bonus, it could be better for your specific build. Now I do think an issue that they have probably ran into is that Diablo 4 is just already kind of bloated in terms of how many things you need for a build to actually work. Like a lot of builds need a handful of legendary aspects to actually work. They probably need one or multiple unique items to work. And now with having the new difficulty system, some builds may even need some mythic uniques to shore up maybe defenses. Like Tyrael's Might chest piece gives you almost all of the resistances you need, so that could be very strong or even needed for certain builds. And I think sets have the highest chance of a new system being added into Diablo 4, but past that, we have ancient items which are white. Now, these are quite unique and quite interesting, because when they first explained these, they said these would be something specific to seasons, which is quite weird, but could be interesting. Now, I think one of the biggest issues that they probably ran into is that some people would want to play the Eternal Realms, and just having a completely new rarity only with seasons would probably throw a pretty big wrench into that. But something like this could be added into the future, but it could actually be something quite interesting that maybe in a future season you get some type of a new rarity that is kind of specific to that season, but that may also just be something that would be only in like one season or something like that, so they could bring it back for a singular season as a new rarity and not have it be something that would be in every season, which is what it sounded like this system would be. It didn't sound like this would be for one season. It sounded like ancient items would be a new rarity in every season, which is quite odd. But then we have what I think is probably the most interesting of these rarities, which is mythic. Now keep in mind, this red mythic rarity is different to our purple mythic rarity right now. We have mythic uniques right now that are purple, but are completely different than this red mythic rarity they were designing a long time ago. And as mentioned, they described these mythic items as the most powerful items in the game, so powerful you could only have one on at a time. And this is kind of reminiscent of something like exotic items from Destiny 2. You can only have one exotic weapon and one exotic armor piece equipped at a time, but Destiny 2 is also a game that doesn't have near as much customization or just item slots as something like Diablo 4, but that could still be a pretty interesting design space. Having these just ultra strong items that you can only have one equipped of at a time. And this is also something I could see coming back. I could see like a new expansion coming out and they just release whatever these mythics would be called now, this red rarity that is something you can only have one equipped of a time, and they're just absurdly strong or unlock some new type of power. Now I do think it would actually be better that this type of design actually comes back as something that isn't a piece of gear you equip. I think it would actually be better if something like this was added into the game, that it was like some enchant or something like that you put on another item or had its own separate UI. Because as mentioned, I think we're kind of bloated on item slots right now in Diablo 4 in terms of we just don't have enough and we already have too many things vying for the slots we already have. And a new mythic item that you would basically always want one equipped would just remove a slot from the game essentially. So I do think it might be better if they added a thing like this, that it was kind of something you add onto an item. Like imagine there's some new enchanting system where you have to go farm up these mythic items, you actually have to get them as a drop, and then you take them back to like an enchanter that then enchants like a mythic enchant, and you can only have one on at a time. I think that some type of system like this could actually be really cool and could just add some crazy powers into the game, because one of the biggest complaints I think we're still seeing from Diablo 4 is that a lot of the uniques or even legendary aspects are still kind of boring. Like we don't get a ton of super cool, say, unique items like we've gotten with, say, the druid unique that spins all of your boulders around you, or the sorcerer unique that spins all of the lightning bolts around you and then they constantly go out and they suck out your mana. Stuff like that is really cool, really thematic, and much more unique items. And I do think a mythic type system can actually do that to a kind of bigger degree, since you could only have one on. It could be something absolutely absurd that just completely changes up how abilities work. And like runes, I think some of these rarities could very much come into Diablo 4 in a bit of a different form, but kind of sharing that base design elements. And there are some other elements that we got with old quarterly updates that I may go over in a future video, but I do think these older rarities have the highest chance of being implemented into Diablo 4 in some way, especially since I think when they were first designing Diablo 4, some of the elements were definitely more inspired by Diablo 3 than Diablo 2. So I do think since Diablo 4 is going more towards Diablo 3 now, I think some of these old designs may come back in some new or augmented way. But that's pretty much all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.